Buenos días, mucho
Good
gusto.
morning. It's a pleasure. Welcome everybody who is joining us in this permanent webinar on democracy in the world, which is organized by the National Electoral Institute of Mexico. And it has been taking place over the past few months. And on this occasion, we'll be talking about Mexican elections that will be held on Sunday, June the 6th. This will be an opportunity for us to think about how our elections compare to other countries and how they are viewed in Mexico as well as abroad. And this electoral process is particularly difficult, and it has approximately 20,000 posts up for the vote. And there are very important positions both at the federal level as well as local level, in addition to 15 governorships. It's also an election that is difficult because it is taking place during the pandemic, and that poses difficulties not just in the logistic sense, but also health and political sense. And it's a very important election as well from the political point of view, because it is the election in which we'll be also voting upon the half administration of President Andrés Manuel López Obrador, who was elected with the largest numbers we had seen in the past few decades. And so this is an election which, from that point of view, that political point of view, it plays an important role. Now I'd like to hand the floor for the inauguration of this event to Dr. Raúl Contreras Bustamante, who is the director of the School of Law at the UNAM, and they're also sponsoring this event. Dr. Contreras, you have the floor. Thank you. Salvador, I apologize. I'm going to speak on behalf of Dr. Contreras because since today is Teacher's Day in Mexico, he's in a specific celebration that we're organizing at the university, and he asked me to speak to all of you on behalf of him. And so because this is an event that is being organized by the National Autonomous University of Mexico together with the INE. This has been a very successful seminar that has been taking place over the approximately past 6 months. And well, my participation should be interpreted on this occasion as the ideal way to show how we are partnered in this event and how we have been working in this alliance between the School of Law and the National Electoral Institute. First of all, I'd like to thank the distinguished panelists that will be participating on this occasion. It's a true privilege for the School of Law, as well as for the INE, to have Dr. Jacqueline Pechard with us today, as well as Dr. Leonardo Valdez. I must welcome them back home. They have worked with our institute in the past at different points in time. I would also like to thank Alejandra Barrios. She's also a friend of the INE and one of the most well-known specialists on the continent in terms of electoral observation. And by the way, she is also the person that is in charge of the observation organization of Colombia. And she's very familiar with our INE and how we handle things in Mexico. And she is one of the organizations, she has one of the organizations that is observing our elections. We also have other people that have been joining us as observers in the past. That's something that has been done in Mexico since 1994. And that's another one of the persons that is participating at this event. And we also have, obviously, Mr. Salvador Romero, who is from Bolivia, a friend, and he's also head of mission. And so we've got specialists in the field with us today, and it's a true privilege to have you with us. The objective of this 9th edition of this webinar is to have an opportunity to analyze the experiences that different countries have had in their own electoral processes, particularly within the framework of the pandemic. The idea behind this seminar came up last year because we wanted to be able to work together with the law school of the National Autonomous University of Mexico, in which specialists from different countries and in different fields could share their learnings and help us to make sure that we could all have better elections. In an era in which democracies are going through difficult times, we thought it was necessary for us to encourage a public discussion about the challenges being faced, but also the pending matters and the achievements, and to share all of this with the audience, with as broad an audience as possible. In that sense, today we will be talking about the elections that are going to be held here in Mexico. I would just like to provide you with a few quick data and make a few comments regarding this election, which is going to be the largest in Mexico, as well as the most complex. We're just 22 days away from the election. It was an electoral process that began in September of last year. And since then, we've had to carry out a series of stages and decisions in order to create the confidence chain in our country, in which we've spoken about things such as the standards that have to be followed in order to ensure impartiality during the race, how to make sure that the state elections are handled correctly, the drawings in which the Mexican civilians who will be participating in the polling stations would be selected, the development of the electoral materials, how they would be distributed throughout the country, the voter registration list, hoping that we have the best list available to date right now, the use of the public resources on the part of the candidates and their parties, amongst many other things. So there have been a series of stages and decisions that have had to be reached to ensure the quality of our elections. And one of the things I would highlight is the way in which citizens have taken ownership of the process. And an example of their commitment to what they're doing is that they're willing to participate. And I'll give you an example. Today, halfway into the period established for determining who is going to be participating in the polling stations on June the 6th, we've got 95% of the citizens that we require in order to be able to help us out in the 163,000 polling stations nationwide. These are numbers that, comparatively speaking, are better than what we had in 2018, in the 2018 election. And back then, of course, the context was different because we didn't have a pandemic. And so the ownership of the electoral process on the part of citizens just goes to show that this largest election in our history is being supported by civilians. And this is something that is unprecedented. We have also been working with the House of Representatives because they will be voted on together with governorships and many different local positions, including town councils, for example. Never in the history of our country had we voted on so many public posts. Something else I would say about this election is that the registration of our voters is more than 93 million voters, which is almost a little over 4 million more voters than we had in 2018. COVID-19 has posed an enormous challenge for electoral activities. And in these webinars, we've spoken about the different measures that can be taken by our institutions to guarantee that democracy and our elections do not become an additional victim of the pandemic. And Mexico hasn't been an exception as to the impact of the pandemic. In 2020, we had to postpone some local elections that were successfully carried out and that didn't affect the number of people that were subject to COVID. And we've seen that in other countries such as Bolivia, Ecuador, Chile, which is going into elections very soon, and which held their elections last year as well. All of this goes to show that holding elections can be done even within these types of contexts, which are very challenging. In other words, the pandemic has not put the brakes on our efforts, and we're not going to allow it to do so. As I've said, I know that Mexico and democracy will be able to move ahead within this context. That said, with all of the measures we have to put in place because of the pandemic, we also know that we are being accompanied by our citizens and that they're all fully committed to this effort to ensure their freedom. The polling stations on June the 6th will be a place in which we'll be able to exercise two freedoms: the freedom that people have to cast their vote without any conditions or exceptions, but also freedom of the spread of COVID. These actions, together with many other actions we've taken and additional measures that we've used for more than 30 years, obviously they're always can be improved on, goes to show that in Mexico, there is no possibility of fraud. Fraud is something that was eliminated once we got rid of those factors that led to so much arbitrary actions taking place. There can be some illegal acts taking place, and it's a responsibility of everybody, of all of the governors, all of the politicians, the political parties, citizens, to make sure that we all comply with the legal framework that we've agreed to and that have led to the creation of specific standards. These are standards and rules and regulations that the INE has applied very diligently, no matter who the subject is that is being subject to problems. I know that sometimes people don't agree with it and they are uncomfortable with it, but fortunately, our system provides the necessary measures that can be taken if you don't agree. You can resort to the electoral court in Mexico so that they can decide on whatever complaints might be filed. And that's the type of electoral process that we have here in Mexico, and that's why we're so strong. I would conclude by saying that on June the 7th, the day after the election, this will be a new story. As of that date, the natural conflicts that might have existed prior to the elections will have to allow us to move on to the next stage, to reach a consensus and move on with our democracy. Mexico is where we all live, and on June the 7th, this is the home. We'll realize that this is a home in which we all live, no matter what our positions, no matter how we view the problems that affect our country and our society. We all have a possibility of playing an important role in our country because we have a democratic process in place that allows us to have a plurality of voices, much in the same way that we all were involved in the creation of the institutional framework that allows us to work in a plural form, in a pacific form and peaceful form. It's also very important that we remember that we have to preserve what we've achieved. Some of them will do so from public positions, others will do so as citizens from their own trenches, and this is something that is important that we remember, that we have to remember that we're going to have a very good future that can be improved on, but whatever we want to achieve can be done peacefully, and it's something that we all have to work on. Democracy in the future has to be a route of continuity and not regression. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, Lorenzo, for your introduction and your institutional comments, as well as the welcoming remarks that you said that you gave us on behalf of the INE, as well as the National Autonomous University of Mexico, because both of you are organizing this webinar. Let's move on to the 4 presentations of the panelists that will be joining us today. Each one of the panelists will have a 15-minute period for their presentations. 2 minutes prior to the conclusion of their 15 minutes, we will inform them that they are approaching their deadline. And then we'll have an opportunity for questions and answers with each of the panelists. Let us begin the activity with the first presentation to be made by Armand Pechard, who is a Mexican specialist who lives in the US and who has given great thought to electoral processes and institutional processes in Mexico. Armand, you have 15 minutes for your presentation. Thank you very much, Salvador. It's a pleasure to see you again. I just wanted to correct you. Like all street dogs, like all mutts, I don't know what nationality I am. I was born in Mexico City, but I'm a Canadian citizen as well as a US citizen. So I just wanted to clarify that. Like all mutts, there's a lot of different types of bloods running through my veins. It's a pleasure to be here with you again. I'd like to thank the INE as well as the UNAM, the National Autonomous University of Mexico, for inviting me to participate in this webinar in which we're going to be talking about the progress and the challenges regarding these June 6 elections in Mexico. Although there has been a lot of progress and a lot of challenges, I think I would just refer to 3 of each. And during the Q&A session, perhaps I can talk about the others. As to the progress achieved, I would mention one that Lorenzo already mentioned, which is the rules and regulations. The second would be the institutionality, and the third would be the audits or the reviewing and monitoring of finances. And for the problems, illegal financing, violence in the electoral process, and the third would be the tension between the government and electoral institutions. Those are the challenges, the 3 challenges. As to the rules and regulations and standards, I know that Mexico is amongst a select list of countries that have carried out many reforms over the past 30 to 35 years to strengthen the legal frameworks that are required for electoral processes. There are reforms that are aimed at creating a level playing field and that at the same time allow plurality and alternation, and given Mexico's history, make it harder for one single party to have a hegemony. Also, something else that Lorenzo mentioned, I would say that these laws have been agreed upon thanks to agreements between political parties, a consensus between political parties, and to a great degree because of the requests being made by the Mexican citizens. Just to give you an idea of the rules and regulations that have been established in Mexico and that are exemplary, I would say that we shouldn't just focus on tweets, posts, or listening to the press conferences of stakeholders. We should instead read the Constitution, read the general law of electoral procedures, and so on, because what Mexico has achieved over the years in terms of improving its rules and regulations for democratic processes is something that is an example for the entire world. When I started my professional career, the IFE, the Federal Electoral Institute, was part of the Ministry of the Interior, and Arturo Núñez, who was from the state of Tabasco, was the head of that institution. And then little by little, that institutionality started to increase, as well as its autonomy and impartiality. And I think the same thing could be said about the National Electoral Institute. And those are institutes that we have to defend and strengthen. I think it's very important that we acknowledge that Lorenzo Cordova is not the INE, nor is the INE its council members. In the case of the INE is actually the 17,000 professional Mexicans that work in that institution, the approximately 60,000 Mexicans that are temporarily hired during electoral cycles, as well as the thousands of poll station workers. I don't think that there is any other institution in Mexico that is that professional, plural, and representative of the Mexican people. No other institution can do that except the INE. That is for sure. And just to show the strength of the INE, or to illustrate that point, is the perception that it has with the people of Mexico, according to a poll conducted by the INEGI, which is the National Statistics Institute, which was published this year but was conducted last year. And what's more, I would say that the INE's strength is acknowledged even by the party in power, because they asked the INE to help them with the selection of the president or chair of their own party. And so the facts speak for themselves. The third point I mentioned is a form of progress is the inspection of the finance. And this refers both to public as well as private financing of political parties, as well as independent candidates during elections. And I would say that if we were to analyze the conflict between the political parties and the electoral institutes, most of them are connected to financing and the way in which the finances are being audited or inspected. I know some of the political parties complain to the effect that the regulatory framework for the inspection of the finances is very complex and it is extremely difficult to implement, especially when you're campaigning in rural zones. But the truth is that the standards and rules and regulations have been established for the specific reason to try to avoid any problems between the parties, whether they be large or small. Political parties and candidates cannot exceed 10% exceed 10% of the amount that they're allowed to spend. And all private donations have to be done through banks, through checks, deposits, or electronic transfers. Cash donations are banned. And the law stipulates that the same thing applies for the use of metals or payments in kind. It's that specific. As to the parties, although I know that that COVID has posed many problems for elections, I've been able to see what has happened in different elections during the COVID crisis. In Ecuador, for example, in the Dominican Republic, and of course here in the US where I live. But I don't want to minimize what happened. But in any case, insofar as the challenges that I'm going to refer to now, I would say that they are more of a systematic nature as to what might happen because of cash. There has been an increase in the auditing of the public financing of political processes, and so sometimes political parties have resorted to unusual forms of financing themselves. illegal donations in cash, which currently are much larger than the private donations that are allowed. The second challenge, I know I'm running out of time, is the violence, the political electoral violence. One of the biggest challenges is the growing trend in Mexico of seeing more political violence, and which concluded with the murder of candidates, political leaders. This is something that is more prevalent at the municipal and state level
in Mexico. And it is the result of a series of factors, which include, in my opinion, the following: the increasing transactionality of political candidacies. In other words, buying candidacies. And therefore, you have a series of special interests that are behind these transactions. The second aspect has to do with the increased participation of drug cartels in Mexican elections, especially when it comes to municipal elections, as well as state elections. And one of the concerns I have in that case is that it is important to remember that democracy, electoral democracy at the municipal level, has to do with the level of democracy that receives the biggest impact in terms of citizens, local citizens. It affects them. We're talking about municipal democracy at risk. The representativeness of the people are at risk as a result of this phenomenon, drug trafficking. And the third aspect is the lack of government control in certain areas in the country. That is a reality. And the third point or challenge that I wanted to bring up, and with this I will conclude my comments, has to do with these tensions between the government and electoral institutions. The objective of political parties is to gain access to elected posts. And once in those posts, they will try to preserve those positions for as long as possible. That means that they will push electoral laws to the limits, and sometimes they will break those laws, which naturally creates a tension with electoral authorities, which have the mandate of applying electoral laws or legislation to guarantee free and fair elections. And what is most important yet, to defend people's will or decisions. Typically, governments at all levels will be above electoral policy or politics, a convention that has been increasingly violated in electoral democracies. And this is something we saw in the US, is that because governments try to discredit electoral legislation and electoral institutions to serve their own partisan interests. The National Electoral Institute in Mexico, like the Electoral Tribunal, have not been exempt from these government attacks during the electoral process of 2021, because the federal government has tried to obtain an advantage in these upcoming elections to create the conditions to claim there was a fraud if the results are not favorable to the government or the political party in power. As a matter of fact, I want to conclude by saying that the most recent statements of the government and certain members of the political party in power have led many Mexicans to believe that they are dinosaurs dressed in sheep's clothing. And this is the end of my initial comment. Thank you. Thanks a lot, Armand, for these thoughts, for this analysis, which in my opinion have been very clear and very accurate when it comes to the scope of your thoughts. And you have identified some issues that are common or that we can commonly find in other countries. Of course, in different levels. But I'm talking that in all cases we can see this clash between governments and electoral institutions. But you also mentioned other aspects that are more characteristic of Mexico, like those unfortunately linked to violence, including the killing of candidates and control by drug trafficking groups on or over certain electoral local processes. And of course, you made mention of funding, which is something widespread or something that we find all over Latin America. And I believe that your thoughts have allowed us to place all these issues in the context of the Mexican election of 2021. Thank you, Armand. And next, we have another presenter. She is Alejandra Barrios. As mentioned by Lorenzo, she may be the leader of the most important local observation organization in Latin America, known as MOE in Colombia, given their scope, the time they've been operating, and also their history of resisting challenges. They are more institutional now, and they are well known and renowned by political actors and social actors in her country, and therefore her organization has a very special place in this context. I would also like to mention that Alejandra won't stay all throughout this seminar. She will have to leave the session almost immediately after having completed her session. But we thank her for joining us. Alejandra, you have 15 minutes. Thank you. Thanks a lot, Salvador. Thank you for your nice introduction, and I would like to apologize in advance for leaving. I will be here up until 10:55 a.m. I believe it's the same time zone in Colombia and Mexico. And the reason is that I have another activity every Friday at 11 a.m. Let me start by going back to what Salvador just said. Let me speak as a citizen, because I want to talk about electoral processes and from there talk about the importance of electoral institutions and security in electoral processes. I believe that the first thing we need to acknowledge and have in mind is that there is no doubt that electoral institutions like the Mexican electoral institutions, which are an example for Latin America, have an important role. In Colombia, for example, every time we want to amend electoral legislation, we always look to Mexico and the robust architecture when it comes to democratic processes, but not only from the standpoint of logistics, but also from the standpoint of advancing democracy. I believe that in Colombia, we haven't found any processes in Mexico that have not led to significant reforms and increased participation by citizens. Also, the architecture of Mexican electoral institutions have their own check and balance systems. And this is where we point to a model where we have an electoral authority like the INE, and then the Electoral Tribunal and the Prosecutor's Office for Electoral Crimes that represents a structure that lets them oversee all the different pieces of the structure, and including all those links that make up the electoral logistics so that you can provide full guarantees for citizens and political parties so that your elections can be fair, with all the information they need and with all the guarantees they need, so that you can make sure that their elections are authentic, transparent, and fair. And now, let me talk about some other aspects based on the Mexican experience. But this also has to do with concerns around electoral debates in Latin America. The first aspect is that whoever oversees elections will determine the final election. By this, my point is that we need electoral authorities so that citizens can have trust. And what we have seen in the case of Mexico, and by the way, I like the term used by Lorenzo, because he talked about the chain of trust. Mexico has developed a series of complex procedures that are aimed at ensuring transparency and the reliability of electoral results, but especially they have a series of cross-referenced controls as part of all these institutions, with the participation of political organizations that have as a sole objective to make sure that all the different parties participating in the electoral process can have the certainty that the votes of citizens count, but also that they are being well counted. The second concern that always exists in Latin American countries: elections can be legitimate, but not necessarily fair or equitable. And this may be one of the deepest or biggest problems we have when it comes to electoral debates in our countries. The question is if the way there political parties gain access to political power is done based on a level playing field, or if there are some sort of imbalances when it comes to the electoral race to favor certain candidates, campaigns, or political parties. And in this regard, I would like to highlight two measures that in Mexico are very strong and that have also been an example for Latin American legislation. The first one has to do with the media, mass media, and as well as the decision to act through electoral authorities in their interaction with communication media, which prevents situations like we have in Colombia, because we have candidates that may be favored by certain media outlets, and that will give them our uneven access to a certain media outlets, and that creates an imbalance when it comes to access by candidates to mass media, and they don't do that. And then we also have the situation of a pandemic when it comes to communication, which means that candidates are working more through social media channels. But that doesn't mean that traditional or mainstream media have stopped having some influence. And in Mexico, this is a permanent debate, because they are debating whether the model must continue or not. But to some extent, that has allowed the different political parties and ideologies, regardless of their closeness to the government or not, or regardless of their capacity to pay for media advertising, will have and must have a level playing field for all the different candidates and political parties. The second aspect has to do with resources to fund campaigns and political organizations. And in this regard, I will want to make reference to campaign funding. One of the main centers of when it comes to the discussion around political campaign financing is access to resources. And if this access to resources is easy or not. And we will be more democratic if we talk about state funding versus private funding. In Colombia, unfortunately, we took the opposite road, compared to Mexico, because we increased our capacity to monitor campaign expenses with the strict rules. In Mexico, they have all these rules, regulations when it comes to funding and use of resources, but also mainly they have a state funding, which is aimed mainly at being more fair, and also to keep private interests away from elections and electoral results, because there are organizations or sectors that have a capacity to spend more money to favor certain campaigns or candidates, and that makes a difference. And that makes a real difference when it comes to the structure of governments and the structure of decision-making in the different governments. But in addition to that, you will have much more democratic political parties because they are not competing over resources that buy power. We're talking about political competition to gain access to power instead of resources. Now, as part of these debates in Latin America, we have the aspect of participation or intervention of political politicians in politics, all the way from the president to local public officers. They must stay away from that political debate, and that's another rule they have. And they shouldn't put at the service of ideological interests or political campaigns the goods and resources of the state directly or indirectly. That's a basic principle that I believe that many of us share in many countries in Latin America, because that basic principle is necessary. And we do have that principle in Colombia also. And we must abide by it to make sure that state resources, money, or structures to avoid that these state resources or structures can influence decisions by facilitating access to state resources or monies, which at the end of the day come from taxpayer money. That basic principle of prohibiting, of avoiding, of restricting the intervention of public officers in political processes are basic so that we can have free and transparent processes in the favor of citizens. And finally, and last but not least, one of the most interesting processes that we have seen when it comes to Mexican legislation that is basically the result of the decisions of INE is that of ensuring or guaranteeing the political rights of citizens. And in this regard, I have to refer to three aspects. One of them is the capacity of control by citizens when it comes to the electoral institutions, because they have access to information, they receive information, they can also participate or watch the sessions of the INE online, especially today, as well as the participation of political organizations or political parties in the council. I don't know if that is the right name, but I believe they call it the council of the INE. You not only have the councillors, you not only have the councillor or president, you also have the participation of political organizations which may not have a vote, but they can express their points of view when it comes to the game of democracy and the rules. That is a recognition that everybody is important in the electoral exercise as the basis of the confidence process. And number two, we have control by authorities. Together with citizens and the mechanisms to delegate these different roles when it comes to elections, because citizens are part of polling stations, so it is not secret for them. It is not a secret for them who is elected. And I believe that another example that we should follow more deeply is everything that has to do with affirmative measures and affirmative actions in terms of inclusion. It's impressive to see what the Mexican state has done, especially the INE with very clear rules when it comes to affirmative actions to include women. And today, the Congress of the Republic of the Federal Mexican State clearly shows, or has clearly shown, that this is a fact, because we have an increasing number of women participating in political affairs, African American with inclusion rules, LGBTIQ participation, and trans or protocols for trans people, which is not only admirable, it was an example for us in Colombia to adopt similar measures to facilitate the participation of transgender populations and indigenous populations, as well as persons with disabilities. I only have 3 minutes left. But I should also mention electoral security, and I would like to briefly make a reference to 3 aspects. The first one of them is the following. It is very dangerous every time the electoral arbitrator becomes the center of the political discussion. I mean, in an electoral process, the center of the discussion should be the electoral campaign, ideological positions, and the proposals. And then you need to change the focus. Changing the focus to electoral authorities will undermine citizens' trust in their electoral authorities, which is unnecessary because in Mexico there is an electoral institution that is strong, including amid the pandemic. So it is always a danger if you allow that discussion to focus on the electoral institution as opposed to electoral campaigns and the political process. And then I would like to talk about all the conditions of risk in elections, which is directly related to violence, unlawfulness, and informality. And in this case, it is important not to forget that electoral processes take place within a context, and that context has to be interpreted by electoral authorities so that they can make whatever innovations and adjustments are necessary to control the process, to oversee funding for political candidacies, and supporting everything has to do with measures to avoid political violence, including violence against candidates or eliminating fear among citizens that may be coerced to vote for other politicians or candidates that are not those of their choice. And finally, you need to pay attention to the crisis of credibility in democracy, especially when it is reinforced by the context of the pandemic, because there is an increase in poverty, there is an increase in unemployment, young people are being more and more affected, women are more and more affected. Take a look at Colombia. Just look at all the protests we're seeing in the streets. This is only a breeding ground for bad decisions, not only bad political decisions, bad decisions when it comes to future reforms that may undermine or weaken electoral authorities that have been developed based on lessons learned from previous electoral processes. This is the end of my comment. Thank you for the time you gave me. Thank you, Alejandra. I believe that we had a great opportunity to hear your interesting thoughts. And this brings me back to one of your initial comments. I'm talking about the importance of Mexico as a leader, and specifically Mexican electoral authorities as an important point of reference for the rest of the countries in Latin America. And it is true. It is true that the Latin American countries will often and have often looked at everything that has happened or happens in Mexico when it comes to their own processes, because Mexican electoral authorities and systems have become a point of reference for many of our countries in Latin America, and even a source of inspiration when it comes to making changes and adjustments. And therefore, we always have an expectation when it comes to Mexican electoral institutions. And of course, in some cases, we always often look at their own concerns and their challenges, especially in those situations where they are under attack as a result of a series of factors that we have already mentioned in these first two interventions. Now, let's go to our third presentation, which will be done by Jacqueline Pechard, who is not only an academician, but has also been an electoral counselor of the IFE, of the Federal Electoral Institute, which means that she has a long expertise when it comes to analysis and reflection, as well as the process of making decisions within the INE. Welcome and thanks a lot, Jacqueline. We have the next 15 minutes. for your presentation. Thanks a lot, Salvador. Thanks to the Electoral Institute and National University School of Law for this opportunity to share all this panel with each and all of you. I'm glad to see Armand. I'm glad to see Alejandra and another colleague of mine, Leonardo Valdez. Thanks a lot. Well, I would like to focus on my presentation on the following. I will go back to some of the aspects mentioned by Armand and other of the aspects mentioned by Alejandra, but let me explain. I would like to go back to the strength of the INE as an institution, not only legislatively speaking. I believe that one of the most important aspects of INE as an institution has to do with the existing capacities, not only as an institution, but also when it comes to the INE's staff. I mean, one of the things that we need in Mexico is good organizational capacities, and the INE is a great example of that, which is not limited to their current authorities. This is something that has been developed over the 25 years of life of the IFE, which is now called INE. I would like to highlight the fact that the electoral organization model that has three big pillars, which include the administration of elections, and then the jurisdictional part, the tribunal, and dealing with electoral crimes, which has to do with the prosecutor's office for electoral crimes, means that our autonomy is not only being attacked by people in power, but they have the government or the state has more control over the prosecutor's office for electoral crimes, even though it is part of the Attorney General's office for the Republic. I mean, and they became autonomous in 2014, but in 2019, they operate under the Attorney General's office. It is clearly captured by the government, and it is under the control of the government today, and their operation is only at the service of whatever the power says. So that model that we have had and that we developed is still strong, thanks to the autonomy of the INE, which means not only everything established in our laws and our bylaws and our constitution, which we often believe is a barrier to the excesses of power, but it's not always the case. The Electoral Tribunal has had erratic behaviors. However, they are not consistent when it comes to their resolutions and determinations, which means that the electoral institution that has had to keep the course and that has been forced to strengthen its skills or capacities is the INE, which is the more political part of this system, because that's where we have the political parties participating most often. But during the course of the last 25 years, the fact is that we have had elections where alternance has been present as evidence, in the sense that there is political competition, which didn't exist in the past because we had a single political party for practical purposes. And the rate of alternation in Mexico is as high as 65.6%, which is a proof that this competition exists, because a political party may win today but not tomorrow. However, the results of election of 2018, this landslide that took Morena and López Obrador to power, has been one of the justifications for us to understand why this electoral process of 2021, which is a midterm election, that typically is an inertial political race, because we are basically a presidential system, has now become more important, precisely because the political party in power wanted to extend that legitimacy they obtained in 2018 and extend that to electoral processes in 2021. So this is not only the largest election in our history, but not only because we have 20,000 posts, elected posts, but especially it is one of the largest, considering the electoral legitimacy that it originally had in 2018. And they cannot just renew that process. You cannot just drag that legitimacy all the way to these elections. One of the aspects mentioned by Armand is the trust, citizens' trust in the INE, which is clearly shown in the civic culture survey of INEGI. We have also seen this in much more recent surveys and polls, like one published by the newspaper El Financiero, which clearly shows citizens' confidence in their institutions.
If this is the example of institutional strength, with the exceptions I already referred to, I think that the challenges beyond the COVID crisis, for example, are things that we most definitely have to find a way to deal with during the elections, as Armando has already said. But I think that one of the things that I should mention is the fact that in 2021, we have had 89 deaths, and yesterday, another candidate was murdered, a very important candidate from the state of Sonora, who was also a former attorney general, and that murder is added on to the other murders. So we have a total of 90 candidates or public officials who have been murdered, and that contrasts with the 85 deaths that we saw in 2018, and we still need another 3 weeks before the conclusion of the political campaigns. And it seems that, as Armand has said, it seems that the state and the public forces of the state have not found a way to deal with this violence, since it's combined with drugs, organized crime, and gangs. The second challenge I would refer to in terms of this election is because there is an environment of embattlement in which almost all cases are appealed before the courts. Almost none of the decisions of the INE go through willingly. There are always appeals being made. And there's this sense of wanting to be litigious. And at the core of this whole process is the fact that not just that there's a conflict between the different political parties, but rather because at the core of the problem is the INE, the electoral institute that counts the votes and which will determine whether the elections are reliable or not. In this case, since we're talking about midterm elections, the one who will be providing the results and determining whether the results are reliable or not is the INE. You can always resort to appeals, but it's the INE who will be deciding everything. And the fact that the INE is at the core of everything, as if it were an additional political stakeholder, speaks to that high level of litigiousness, in which instead of focusing on the offers being made by the candidates and the parties, it's focused more on things such as the conflict between the federal government and the INE. And the worst part of all is that not only is it the president, but also his political party, MORENA, that they have stated that they are not confident in the INE. As Armand said, it seems that they are preparing themselves to be able to say that it is not an organization that can ensure the proper counting of the votes, and that there is a sense of delegitimization of the electoral process as well as of the political stakeholders. And all of this is very different from what was originally said back in 2018. Alejandra had already mentioned this, that I'm going to refer to right now. Within this litigious environment, there's also the fact that the behavior of the President of the Republic during the electoral process has been very obvious. It's constant, it's permanent, and the number of measures that the INE, or the number of decisions by the INE to try to limit the comments being made during the morning press conference, because he refers to either the opposing political parties or he refers to the INE, they have all been appealed to the tribunal, to the electoral tribunal or electoral court, and they have rejected all of those appeals. They have systematically rejected them, and so this, it seems, will continue even during the last 3 days prior to the elections, because after, only 3 days before the election, nobody can make any political comments. And so up until then, it will seem that the electoral court will continue to not agree with the appeals being made by the INE, because it seems it has been doing so systematically up until now. And so within this context of litigiousness, we have to see what the impact has been on the political campaigns, which is what we should be focusing on, actually. And the political campaigns up until now have been very, they don't seem to have much substance to them. They don't provide any suggestions and proposals as to what they want to do. It seems that the candidates are more focused on having nice jingles and acting like clowns or whatever, instead of talking about the proposals that they'd like to put on the table. They're clear proposals. And so what I would say is that the level of our political campaigns is extremely poor, because on top of everything, as a result of 2018, what we had was we saw a fragmentation, pulverization of all of the political parties, to the degree that only because they've been able to partner during these elections have they been able to continue with this environment of polarization. And since I've only got 4 minutes left, is that right? Do I have 4 minutes left, Salvador? You've got 2 minutes left. Okay, 2 minutes. Okay, so in the next 2 minutes, I just wanted to say something about what Alejandra mentioned, which is affirmative actions. That has definitely been important. The INE, through a political agreement, made sure that the candidates for the 15 states in which there are governorships up for election, they would include women. And so the political parties had to comply with that rule. And another thing that the INE did at the suggestion of civil society organizations is that they have 3 out of 3, which fights political violence, and in which all of the candidates must formally declare that they are not they're not associated with any type of domestic violence cases, rapes, or any type of sexual assault, nor do they have any commitments that they have not complied with regarding alimony or child support. And so with that, I would like to conclude, and I would just add a comment regarding participation and voter turnout of youth. Youth are a wonderful opportunity to make sure that we have sufficient voter turnout, and to make sure that they participate, so that we can have a voter turnout of at least 50%. But I'm sure that with the participation of youth, that number can be even higher in spite of the pandemic. In any case, there was a survey that was conducted and that Armand referred to regarding civic culture here in Mexico, and in which youth seem to be interested in political matters. And it seems that their interest is very constrained. They are interested in what's happening at the political level, but above all, they're interested in communication through social media. Young people believe that social media allow them to participate, and they acknowledge that their participation is more connected with citizens that are exercising their rights instead of being citizens that are responsible. So it would seem that young people believe that voting is a right, not a responsibility. Young citizens still do not acknowledge that it's a responsibility of theirs. But young people, youth, do show a clear inclination in favor of democracy. Youth, for example, have a 75% approval rating of democracy vis-a-vis the general population, which is just 69%. 80% of youth believe that votes can help us to have better government. So we do have to rest assured that young people will help us with these elections, because that's what we need for this election within this context of confrontation between the electoral authorities. And the more people vote, the better, so that they take ownership, as Lorenzo Cordova said, of the electoral process. Thank you very much, Salvador. Thank you. Jacqueline. I think that was a series of very important comments that you just made, in which you spoke about what's happening with the democratic system and our electoral processes, as well as the risks and challenges we're facing, in addition to the very difficult relationship that sometimes might exist between electoral authorities and governments. And your final comment was important in the sense that not only should youth participate, but it should be more than what we've seen in the past, because in Latin America, it seems that the number of young voters participating has been dropping, at least in the region. Now I'd like to move on to the fourth and final presentation for today, and I'd like to ask Leonardo Valdez to please take the floor. He is also an academician, and he had been an electoral official. He was the chief electoral official or president of the IFE. And so I would like him to take the floor for the next 15 minutes. Thank you, Leonardo. Thank you, Salvador. It's a pleasure to see my friend Jacqueline Pechard, as well as Armand. And Alejandra just had to log off, but I too would say hello to her. With Armand, I've had the opportunity of talking on many an occasion, most of the time as an electoral official, and I've been able to listen to his opinion regarding the work we were doing. And with Alejandra, we've been involved in electoral observation. Recently, I observed some of the Colombian elections, and we worked very closely with Alejandra that time around. I would, of course, like to thank the law school of the National Autonomous University of Mexico and the National Electoral Institute of Mexico for inviting me to this very interesting webinar. The disadvantage of being the last one to make a presentation today is that I think everybody else has covered all the bases. We've spoken about the situation of the INE in Mexico, and I believe that this is very important. You've also spoken about the challenges that the INE has before it and how they've managed to deal with the challenges. And the analysis that Jacqueline gave us of the process is impeccable. I would agree with everything she said. She has given us a very objective vision of what is happening.
Dos cosas que ya se dijeron y que me siento obligado a resaltar.
I would like to say two things. One is with regard to affirmative actions. I think it's extremely important that we acknowledge that in Mexico, as of the 2012 reforms, we often refer to the 2014 reforms, but the whole process actually began in 2012. And starting then, in 2012, there has been a significant change in the rights of Mexicans. In 2012, citizens were allowed to participate in public consultation processes. We established the need for gender equality. We also started to work on the issue of the re-election of federal as well as local Congress people and municipal presidents. And so it's been a stage that has been enriched by decisions reached by the electoral authorities with regard to the rights of citizens, and that is extremely important. I would also add that the INE has managed great success in improving its organizational capacity. Lorenzo Cordova referred to this in his initial comments when he told us that 95% of the citizens that will be participating as poll station officials have already been selected. And that's an extraordinary number, not only because the elections are just 20 days away, but also because it shows, as Lorenzo said, that citizens are taking ownership of the electoral process. In that segment that everybody is interested in which it be the citizens themselves who take the votes, count the votes, and the ones who fill in the certificates. Election Day in Mexico is one in which Mexico's citizens become the electoral authorities, and that chain of confidence in Mexico's democracy has one of its most important expressions there. And so I would like to congratulate the INE for its technical capacity and capability for these, so far as these elections are concerned, which are very well organized.
Segundo, una tercera cuestión que también es responsabilidad del INE, que ya se mencionó.
There's another point that is one of the INE's responsibility and that has already been mentioned, but I'd like to highlight, in which it's been difficult for Mexico to achieve equality in electoral processes. Alejandra referred to that. For example, the need to have equal access to radio and television on the part of all of the political parties, as well as others. I believe that the INE, which has learned from the experiences of the IFE, and they've done a very good job of managing this prerogative that the political parties have, and which we always view as a benefit for the parties because they get free access to radio and television. But it also has to do with another part of the electoral process that benefits from all of this, which are citizens. Currently, we as citizens have information in a timely fashion, abundant information, so as to know when the elections will be taking place, what posts are up for election, and basically who is going to be competing in the elections. It would be better if the tone of the debate were to be better. Instead of having 30 spots on radio or TV, perhaps we should have longer TV programs or radio programs in which the candidates can debate their platforms. But in Mexico, we've seen that Mexicans have a lot more information regarding the elections than we used to have in the past. And that is something that drives participation, voter turnout. I think that that's one of the reasons why young people, as you said, Jacqueline, are much more interested in politics, and they're much more committed to the democratic process, as well as in exercising their right to vote. Insofar as financing is concerned, we have to talk about how that financing is being audited or overseen. Our regulations stipulate that the pre-candidates have to report on the money they spend and they take in during their campaigns. And here, I would emphasize that they have to report on the money that comes into their campaigns, because when the whole concept of pre-campaigns was begun, legislators found their possibility of having private sources to the politicians so as to not have an impact on the balance of the political parties. And so all the political parties had their own resources that they could use to compete in the elections. And that's why it's so important for them to report on the money that comes in, as well as the money that they spend. And so any candidate who does not report on that, they cannot be registered as candidates. And I believe that the INE has played the role it should to show that whoever does not comply with this regulation, they cannot compete. I believe that this is something else that we should mention when we talk about the strength of the National Electoral Institute. In the last few minutes of my presentation, I would like to talk about something that had not been mentioned previously, and which is more on the political side of the political process. There are 21,000 positions up for vote, 500 for congressmen, 15 governorships, many other positions. And for the first time ever, the 32 states in the Mexican Republic have a local election going on at the same time as the federal election. And some of the foreign visitors who might be joining us from other parts of the world might ask themselves, why didn't that happen before, and how come that is happening now? Well, I would explain that each of the states would organize their own constitution over the years, and the terms that you decided on to elect their governors and officials varied. It wasn't until reforms were undertaken in 2007 when the federal Congress instructed the local Congresses that they had to make the necessary adjustments so that their local elections could take place at the same time as the federal elections. There are some who wonder if this is an advantage or not for democracy, but what I would say is that this process, which began in 2007, is reaching one of its final stages, because this is the first time in which we have 32 states that are holding their elections at the same time as the federal elections. And this is relevant because in our tradition, the midterm elections were elections in which there was not much participation. When there were presidential elections, there was high voter turnout, but during the midterm elections, the turnout was much lower. But since that reform took place, and when the local elections, particularly of governors, were started to be synced, we've seen an increase in voter turnout. What's happening at the federal level, in the sense that when there are presidential elections, there is increased voter turnout compared to the midterm elections, will now change, because now when we had already seen also that when they were only voting for governorships and not municipality positions, elections voter turnout would also be lower. So we believe that since all of the elections are being held at the same time, we will see an increased voter turnout. And I believe that in spite of the pandemic, in Mexico, we'll be seeing a voter turnout of more than 50% of our voter registration list, which is a high level for our conditions, because in Mexico, we are supposed to vote. It's mandatory for us to vote, but there is no sanction if you do not vote, because it is more of a right, not an obligation. So what we saw in 2008, when we saw that avalanche with the president's numbers being very high, that gave very good results for a coalition of parties that were very young. MORNA was a new party. Well, that avalanche, as many called it at the time, others called it a tsunami, I could also call it an earthquake, is something that led to, that was ultimately affected by a dike, in the sense that in the other elections that took place in 2018, the MORNA party only won 22% of the local positions that were up for election. And that was because municipal elections are the most important elections for most citizens, because they're the closest authorities to them for their daily lives. And so I get the impression that in this election, we're going to see more a stronger race for the municipal level, at the municipal level and at the governorship level. And I think that is going to lead some very interesting changes in Mexico. And we're going to continue to see the pluralism that we have built with great difficulties over the years in order to protect our democratic processes. Thank you very much. And I hope that during the Q&A session, I can delve into greater detail. Thank you very much, Leonardo. I think your comments have been very appropriate, bearing in mind the other remarks that have been made by the other panelists. And you've given us additional things to think about, specifically what you mentioned about the fact that these local elections will be taking place at the same time as the federal elections, and how that will probably have an impact on voter turnout. And I also think that you also referred very significantly to the need to understand what will be happening at the local government level, at the municipal government level, after these June 6 elections. I would propose that we do the following. I've been summarizing some of the questions that have been posted, and I'm going to try to summarize them even more and ask you the questions, and you can respond in the opposite direction in which we started. So that means that Leonardo would answer first, and we could focus on the concerns or the questions that have been posed by the people, and there would seem to be two blocks of questions.
One of them has to do with the impact of this tension or friction between the government and the INE, and what should be the behavior of the government, or as mentioned as another presenter, how to move INE away from the center or of the debate. And the other question is, how can you encourage the participation specifically of young people in elections? And for these two sets of questions, depending on your preferences, we will have a limit of 3 minutes. And let's start with Leonardo. Thanks a lot, Salvador. I actually saw some of these questions in the chat box. And I can see that you have put them in a great order. Well, what is actually happening today is serious. I'm talking about these tensions between the federal government in Mexico and more specifically, as mentioned by Jacqueline, between the Mexican president and his political party and electoral authorities. Of course, it is not desirable to see that the INE is a part of the debate in the electoral process. I believe that the INE, I said it before, has done a great job. And the truth is that the problem we have is that the president, the Mexican president, didn't make the decision to be a head of a state. I mean, he has preferred to maintain this position he had as a political party leader. And this position has led him not only to head-on confrontations with electoral authorities, which in my opinion is inappropriate. But he has also broken the law. I mean, we have laws, and since 2017, that electoral laws clearly say that public officers should not intervene in electoral processes. As a matter of fact, the law says that they should be neutral and that they are banned from using public resources to attempt to influence electoral preferences of citizens. And the Mexican president has violated those laws. I mean, there have been a large number of complaints in this regard. I mean, this has happened in the past, but the number of complaints were not as large as they are today. In my opinion, the Mexican president should think about it. especially considering what he has done in recent days and change his attitude to stop acting as a political party leader and instead act as a head of the state, allowing this electoral process to flow the way it should based on democratic principles so that citizens can vote freely and can elect our representatives to the lower chamber and outside of Mexico City to local congressmen and women and municipal presidents. I believe that this is a challenge that the Mexican president should overcome. It would be great if the international community could make a statement to demand he act as a head of state and not a political party leader. Thank you, Leonardo. Now, let's listen to Jacqueline. Again, you have 3 minutes. You can answer one or the 2 questions I already read. Thank you, Salvador. I would like to make reference to this question on the short and mid-term impact of these terrible tensions between the head of the executive and the INE. And more specifically, Ciro Murayama and Lorenzo Córdoba. And I mentioned them because the attacks from the president are targeted at them specifically. And that undermines trust in the authority, even though citizens, according to polls, trust their electoral authorities. What has been happening in recent months is circle. A harmful cycle that is affecting electoral authorities that would only have the outcome of citizens making the decision not to vote. And this is important because there is a limited trust in Mexican institutions in general. And the INE has worked hard to gain the trust of citizens and nevertheless, there is a systematic discourse by the president that questions the authority of our officers at INE, and that will limit voter turnout. So that's the most immediate consequence. Citizens shying away from polling stations and undermining trust in electoral institutions. And the other question has to do with expensive elections, but poor people in the country. Well, I believe that one aspect we must bear in mind is the cost of the elections in Mexico. It is a fact that electoral laws, especially in recent times, have given more responsibility to electoral authorities, but that requires resources. But this model is flawed in terms of its costs because of these reasons. But a significant portion of this cost also has to do with funding for political parties. And every time they attempt to cut the budget, if they do it, they will cut any expense but funding for political organizations or political parties, even though some political parties promise publicly that they will give some of those resources back, which is always a lie. So we have an environment of lies. But the president still has a high level of acceptance, so he is not being questioned. And now when it comes to young people have always been the most reluctant social sector when it comes to participating in elections. They like to participate in less regulated activities and not electoral activities. And the only way we can appeal to them is through political parties. Political parties should be the ones calling them to participate and inviting them to join them as members, which is something that the political party known as Movimiento Ciudadano is doing. It's not that they are not interested in politics. They're not interested in the way our political parties do politics. Thank you, Jacqueline. Let's go to our last participation, which is Armand's participation for 3 minutes. We cannot hear you, Armand. Thank you, Salvador. I would like to answer the question as to whether elections are expensive and the people are poor. I would say that yes, the cost, obviously, of our electoral process is a reflection of what the electoral authorities have done in an attempt to guarantee that we have a level playing field for political parties. But political parties are the ones who have approved all the legislation behind this system. And the way I would answer that question is as follows. People's will, I mean, if you use this reference of the INE as the arbitrator of electoral processes, I would say that people's will is really important, so much so that we deserve a good quality referee. I mean, many people believe that this is something similar to a match played by kids in the street. No, that's not the case. I mean, we need a FIFA kind of arbitration or referee in these processes. And the other aspect has to do with this. How should, somebody made the question, what should governments do to improve democracy and move the INE away from the center of the debate? I don't know if these current attacks on electoral institutions in Mexico could be part of the COVID phenomenon. I mean, we have seen it in the US and in all other countries. There is a significant economic contraction when it comes to our economies. Tax collection has dropped in many countries. It is difficult for politicians to justify their re-election or the re-election of their political parties in an environment where it has been difficult for them to showcase achievements because they don't have many. So I don't know if this has to do with the COVID-19 pandemic, but it may be a factor. So what can we do to move the INE away from the center of the debate? Well, governments should govern. President Trump made a mistake. He thought that if he sent out tweets, of them a day, that would be the same as governing the country. And the same applies to the Mexican president who relies on his morning press conferences. One of his big achievements, however, was that of taking a left-wing party to power. That was an opportunity to claim that they wanted to help marginalized people. But that is an opportunity that he is wasting because he has authoritarian threats instead of focusing on governing the country, which is sad. That's the end of my comment. Thanks a lot, Armand. I would like to conclude by giving a special thanks to Alejandra, who had to leave. She couldn't stay until the end of the session, but I would like to thank Jacqueline, Armand, Leonardo for your participation, and especially for helping us place the debate around this electoral process in 2021 in a broad context, especially with their thoughts about everything that is at stake in this electoral process. And we have not made that much reference, however, to the issue of the pandemic. in this electoral process. But you're right, it may also be an important factor, and that also reflects the importance of other issues that have overshadowed the situation of COVID-19. And I believe that this certainly reflects the political divide and the political concerns that go beyond the impact of coronavirus on the electoral process. So my conclusion is that this has been a very insightful process for all of us in Mexico, but it has also been a comprehensive approach and a comprehensive overview for those who watch us outside of Mexico, especially those interested in the different aspects of the electoral process in Mexico. We have had a series of participations that are plural and have reinforced each other, and I am sure that our audience can now have a better understanding of what happens in Mexico and the different nuances of the Mexican electoral process and the challenges ahead of us when it comes to advancing its consolidation and everything that is at stake on the elections of June the 6th, Sunday. So once again, I would like to thank each and all of the different presenters and all of those who have joined the session to listen to our presentations. And we want to invite you to the next session of this permanent seminar, which will allow us to continue to reflect on electoral and democratic processes in these challenging times of COVID-19. Thanks a lot to all of those who are watching this transmission. Thank you.
Gracias, encantada de verlos.
En las elecciones más grandes de la historia.
Orientación sexual, identidad y expresión de género.
Edad, nivel educativo,
condiciones de salud o discapacidad. Tenemos derecho a participar y a votar.
Porque nuestro voto cuenta igual.
El INE garantiza nuestra participación con protocolos de atención y medidas sanitarias.
Sin ninguna diferencia
y en igualdad de condiciones. El 6 de junio, el voto sale y vale.
Contamos todas, contamos todos. INE.